I'm going to call the September 6, 2018 Finance Committee to order. It's about 8:49 p.m. here in the Mona Lisa Drexler Assembly Chambers. This meeting is called to order immediately following the Assembly meeting. I'm going to ask for a new roll call since we had people join us.
Report, but she was going to.
I'd like to note for the record that Mr. Gray is excused. Ms. Dodge.
Here.
Mr. Lawrence.
Here.
Ms. Major.
Here.
Mr. Roberts.
Here.
Mr. Tackey.
Here.
Mr. Lojeski.
Here.
Mr. Quist.
Here.
Mr. Cooper.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. I think everybody who is here was here for the safety briefing earlier, but if there's an emergency, look for the nearest safe exit, follow the exit signs or the path that will get you to safety the fastest. We have no memoranda reports or presentations this evening, nor do we have any contracts or bid awards. That brings us to agenda item 4, advanced ordinances and resolutions. The first ordinance is ordinance number 2018-20-1H, an ordinance amending the FY 18-19 budget by appropriating $50,000 from the general fund balance to the multi-year general subfund for a joint U.S. Army Garrison and Fairbanks North Star Borough Recreational Athletic Facility Planning, Charrette, and Implementation Plan. Sponsors Mayor Castle's information at page 3. Ms. Major?
I do have a conflict of interest regarding this ordinance. I'm intimately involved in the project from a U.S. Army Garrison, Alaska perspective.
All right, thanks. I'll rule that you have a conflict and you can rejoin us after the presentation. Just as a reminder, we're in committee now, so no debating here at the Finance Committee. There's additional information on this item in the green folders that are included within your yellow folders. Mayor Castle, may we have a staff report?
Certainly can. I'm pretty excited about this. The Army nationwide is starting a new program. They're trying to improve the way they work with neighboring communities where they have installations and see what kind of economies of scale and partnerships that can be created to do mutually beneficial type projects, ongoing contracts, procurement, all sorts of things. In other words, how can we work together? And this is one of the first here locally coming out of this new project and idea. So the concept here is that Fort Wainwright has a significant need for both recreation and what they call PT, physical training, every day in the morning, and they don't have an indoor facility adequate for taking care of their PT, and they have aging infrastructure as we do for recreational facilities, and they're trying to kind of scratch their head on the best path forward. As you're aware, we have aging infrastructure and needs in our community also, and this could be a mutually beneficial way to help both organizations and save both of us money in the long run. This project going forward, we are not obligating ourselves to anything. What we're doing is chipping in. This is a cooperative project where the U.S. Army is putting in $250,000 to do a deep dive into the possibilities here. And we're going to match that with just $50,000 for our share and investigate what possibilities exist. There are no preconceived notions on exactly what this building would be. It would be something that would address physical training and recreation and athletics for both the base and the community. So the concept is kind of build something on the fence line, so to speak, of Fort Wainwright that has easy access from the base, also easy access from the community, and not interfering with the security interests of the base, obviously, when the public is using it, and not requiring everybody that's using it from the community to have to go through the gate and access the base. Okay, so the Army is very interested in this project because they have some necessities that have to be addressed on base and some other things that fall more into replacement area on aging infrastructure, as I was mentioning. But what we need is significant research to make sure that whatever we're building is not some sort of a white elephant, if we build anything, that it's not a lodestone for either Fort Wainwright or the borough, and serves our needs. Our old business model from the borough's perspective, and to a certain degree Fort Wainwright's, has been to build individual standalone facilities. We have a lot of those. We've been talking a lot about those. Every one of those facilities requires a significant subsidy. This isn't unique to our community, it's nationwide. When you build a standalone sports recreation type facility that only has essentially one generic use, it requires a large subsidy. When you look nationally at these, when you combine facilities together, it creates a synergy and a traffic pattern that ends up putting the building not into a subsidized situation in many scenarios. I did a lot of research on this as Parks and Rec Director, and those communities that have done community recreation centers, a lot of them have built centers that actually make money. So it can be done. This is no guarantee that we would ever get there. This is no guarantee that we would have a hockey rink or a tennis court or a soccer field or anything in this particular recreation athletic center. This is the money to do a deep dive to see what our community needs, what our numbers are, what our capacities are, the direction we might want to take, and how we would put this together to create something that wouldn't be necessarily a highly subsidized facility like we're currently dealing with in our recreation system. If we find a nice solution, then it would come back, obviously to the Assembly with here's a plan. What do you think of this plan? We're under no obligation by this to do anything more than provide the $50,000 and be part of this planning process. We have to dedicate some staff time to the planning process to go in and talk about this and see where it goes. And if it goes nowhere, it's the end of the story. If it goes somewhere we think could be highly productive for us and create the kind of facility that we need, then we can move forward and see how we want to pay for it. But Fort Wainwright, obviously, as federal government, they have a little deeper pocket than we do, and they also are highly motivated on this particular project, which is why they're putting in $250,000 while we're putting in $50,000. So in your yellow folders is the proposed memo of understanding for this project. On page 2, the number 1 item on it says specifically that this is not requiring the obligation of future funds or the expenditure of funds other than the $50,000 that we're putting in here right now. So I guess with that, we'll take questions.
Mr. Lejeski.
Would this facility include a pool?
It could. I mean, there's no preconceived notion. That's what this project that we're funding here is for, is to look at it and say, do we want to put a pool in it? And
Right.
it certainly could include one.
So it could include a pool that could act as a potential replacement for one of the current borough pools. That's a possibility.
Yeah, or 2 borough pools. It's a possibility.
Mr. Lawrence?
This ordinance before us is just to appropriate the $50,000. This memorandum of understanding, would that be a separate matter that would come to before the Assembly later? Or is this?
No, this memo, no. This is the memo of understanding. It's just hot off the press and we didn't actually sign it yet. So it's why it's labeled draft, but it's really not drafty other than it's missing 2 signatures, mine and Colonel Fisher's.
But this is subject to approval of the Assembly. Will passing this ordinance, does that constitute approving?
Approval, it constitutes approval of this memo of understanding between us. That's part of this, is the approval of this.
Okay, I don't see that in the ordinance itself, but.
Section 5.
Oh, yeah, well.
Section 2.
Authorization, I do, Section 2. All right. So have there been any kind of preliminary discussions other than just setting up this process? As far as what type, what scope we're talking about, or, what type of facility?
There's an incredibly lengthy laundry list of things we could consider putting in this facility, but there's been no in-depth investigation of what is realistic and what isn't. The kind of complexes that generate revenue instead of requiring subsidies include things that you might not be thinking of here. Things like restaurants, multiple restaurants, a restaurant bar, and a restaurant, a sports goods store to provide supplies, a sports medicine office area, because we're going to have a lot of athletes there that are going to want to look to sport medicine doctors for assistance and having somebody on site. Daycare center, an indoor playground, which we don't have in Fairbanks, which is a community that could use one in January, a large indoor playground that could complement then a daycare center that would be there. Those are the kind of synergies that start working together where you get productive businesses that you can lease to as opposed to government running it. There could be potentially lots of private sector operations leasing portions of the building, like the daycare section that's next to our playground that's in there, training rooms with equipment, and multiple use spaces that can service more than one sport. So you could have a hockey rink that could be used as a soccer field, that could be used as a baseball field. So when you host tournaments, you can convert spaces to be able to hold larger groups. These are the kind of facilities that actually generate revenue and the kind of traffic to be, productive. But they need to be tailored to a community and the needs of that particular community. I don't think we want to put polo grounds in here because polo's not the biggest sport in Fairbanks. So that's what the shred is about, to take a look at the number of people that we have participating in different sports and activities. What do we need for swimming pools, for capacity? How do we service seniors in the community, and what kind of things are missing in Fairbanks for different populations, like the little kids in an indoor playground that we're missing, and can this fit that need? We need to research all of that. That's what this $300,000 total package is about, the charrette, to bring the different subject matter experts, is the latest buzzword for that, SMEs, together to talk about all these different activities and start running some numbers and looking at what we might want to try to incorporate in this. So it's a lengthy process. This won't be built this winter. I mean, we won't even have any decisions for quite a while. But this is $300,000 total package to dive into this deeper and see where we need to go. It may even require more money. The estimate originally was that was more than enough money to take care of this. And chatting with Colonel Fisher this morning, this could be a tight budget depending on how efficient we are. This is a big planning process, and we need to do it right. It's going to have to engage a lot of people over a lengthy period of time so that we don't build some sort of monstrosity that's a waste, and so it's going to need to be tailored to our community to work.
Thank you.
I have Ms. Dodge and then Mr. Quist.
So one of my main concerns, well, there are many, but one of the first ones is you seem to be describing the Fairbanks Athletics Facility a lot, FAC. They have a restaurant, they have a sports facility, they have a pool, and they are private, and they have exercise, and that's a concern for me. They struggle. And yes.
I just want to veer too far towards debate here.
Thank you. Well, if you'll give me leeway, since I don't get to debate next week, I'd appreciate some of that too. But I'm curious. I'm worried about that. It's the first thing I thought of, and it continues to be a concern. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us more about, what is this planning process envisioned? And are we going to be looking at competitors? Are we going to be looking, you talked about gaps. So can you get us a little bit more warm and fuzzy about what the process is?
Well, yes, we are going to consider all of that. That's part of the dive into the community with where are the gaps, what's available, and where do we need to supplement or augment different things available in our community, and that varies from one thing to another. We don't want to duplicate services or put people out of business. I know you've received a number of emails. I lost count, from the tennis folks. The tennis opportunities in town have recently decreased dramatically, and that's a concern. That was available at the athletic club, and it didn't pencil out for them. Does this facility need to try to address that? Obviously, from the number of emails you got and I got, the tennis people think so. I don't know. That's what this charrette is about. The planning process is to look at those things and try to not compete or duplicate something that's being taken care of in our community. We know that there's a number of different facilities that are tight for capacity. We know that we have a number of facilities that are aging and need a lot of work, and we need to weigh all of this and try to figure out what's going to be the most economical way for our community to provide a high quality service as best we can. So, and you'll be included in this. I mean, the Assembly can be included in this. The intention is the more the merrier as far as discussing what we should do and what we shouldn't do with this facility. This is the process to do all of that.
Can you add a little flesh to the bones on the process?
So we're hiring, the intention would be to hire a consultant to conduct a full-blown charrette, and
What would that look like? What is the charrette? Tell us what that means.
public engagement, subject matter expert engagement, looking at stakeholders in the community, and going down the trail through a planning process. And a lot of planning processes, like from our planning department, evolve as you go. As you get more information in, you start diving deeper down some trails and you stop going down other trails because you eliminate and decide we're not going to have a polo ground, so we're not going to research that anymore. We think we might need another hockey rink, so let's dive deeper into that and run some more numbers and bring in some more hockey people to talk about this. What kind of partnerships can we build for managing this, like the agreements that we use with different associations in town? Does the soccer association want to manage a portion of this in return for exclusive use at some period of time? Do they want to do it? Does the tennis association want to do something like that? And if so, how would we pencil out that kind of an agreement? What would that look like? All of this is an incredible amount of work to go through, and there are no preconceived notions, as I've said, so it's going to be an evolving community-wide project to just keep working through it and seeing if we want to go here.
Mr. Quist?
Thank you. So I ideally ask our resident expert, Ms. Major, but unfortunately she's prohibited to speak on this. So I'll ask the mayor, maybe on base, the Army, what facilities or programs do you happen to know that they might be trying to augment or replace?
They have a number. One of their primary concerns is PT. Their training is challenging for them in the wintertime, and so they want a big field house that they can just exercise in. That's one of their big concerns. They have concerns for indoor play areas also. They have a lot of youth on base, as you might imagine. And so what could work with their daycare operations and whatnot, what they could move there. They have a lot of different recreation interests, and their existing recreation facility is pretty grossly overloaded for its weight training areas and whatnot. And so all of that PT type stuff they're really cramped on. And, you know, there's just, they have an aging swimming pool also. And they're trying to decide what to do with that and how to address that issue. So this is very, very ground floor level. And it's why I think it's a good thing that I can't give you definitive answers. The public needs to give us definitive answers. We need to do research. And I'm saying there's no preconceived notion, I think, other than we have to address the PT training for Wainwright, which helps us too, because we don't have a big field house in town for indoor soccer, regulation size fields and that sort of thing. So a big open play area that's multiple use that every community in the north has, except for us, that you could play baseball in and soccer and PT. That's, I think, a given for this facility. That was the initial driver for all of this, I think. We've had, when I was Parks and Rec director, I had two consistent, regular complaints from the public. One was lack of a field house type facility here, like the big dome in Anchorage that fell down because it was an inflatable dome and not. They wanted to build one here too, and I said, no, it'll fall down. And they told me I didn't know what I was talking about, but it turns out I did. But anyway, we need something like that because of our environment and our long winters. And the other one is a play area for youngsters, that they can really run around and be crazy little kids in the wintertime. It's our cold climate that is really driving it, the need for an indoor type facility like that. And there were two things that were just beyond the scope of our Parks and Rec department, and I never addressed. And now we have an opportunity to address those things, and because Fort Wainwright needs them also, I think that we would see the vast majority of this be federal funding, or there's a variety of different options for funding all of this. And we obviously don't have a deep pocket or a lot of money to put into this, but it could save us an awful lot of money in the long run. Consolidate some of our Parks and Rec things, and I mean, there's just so many options, and I don't know where it will all go. We need to study it and run more numbers. The research that I did is now 20 years old, and it needs to be duplicated to see what can happen now.
Thank you.
Additional questions or discussions on this ordinance? I'm not seeing any, so I think we're good. Ms. Smart, thank you for sticking around. Nick's doing a great job back there.
I think you got it.
All right, so we'll move on to the next ordinance. So we've got several important ordinances both in front of the Finance Committee and the Committee of the Whole, but remind folks that we're sitting as a committee and there is no time limit on our discussion tonight. We go as late as we go, so folks might want to keep that in mind. And I'll welcome Ms. Major back to the dais. So next up, we have ordinance number 2018-20-1D, an ordinance amending the FY 2018-19 budget by appropriating $325,000 to the Capital Projects Fund from the North Star Fire Service Area Fund balance for the purchase of self-contained breathing apparatus. Sponsors Mayor Castle. There's information at page 10 of our packet. Mayor Castle.
Yes, thank you. We'll go to Mr. Brad Paulson for the report.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through the chair, this ordinance is seeking approval for $325,000 for the replacement of self-contained breathing apparatus for the North Star Fire Service area. This money will be coming out of their fund balance. This project was brought forth to their commission and has the support of their commission, and their fund balance does have the designated amount of money in it. Their fund balance at this particular juncture is just over $610,000, so they do have the money for this. A little background on this project. A regional federal grant was was done by 4 other local departments previously earlier this year, and changed the style and make and model of air packs that are being utilized within the Fairbanks North Star Borough. They went through an extensive evaluation process, was led by the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The vendor was Mine Safety Appliances, or MSA. They are one of the leading, as a matter of fact, they are the leading manufacturer of this type of device in the country and are very well known. To ensure interoperability, the North Star Fire Service area wanted to be able to purchase MSA air packs, so we are looking at doing a brand-specific purchase on this. The University of Alaska did go through an extensive process, and proposals were done on this. They went through an entire, in February, they went through an entire evaluation process at the Fire Training Center amongst 2 leading companies, which was MSA and Scott. MSA was the selected vendor. The vendor for the air packs is a local vendor, Arctic Fire and Safety, here in Fairbanks. The pricing, because MSA wanted to get into the Fairbanks North Star Borough market and the state of Alaska market, is outstanding. They're going to save approximately $2,000 per air pack, which is about $120,000 savings if they're able to utilize this bid that was done by Arctic Fire and Safety. We wanted to try to do a piggyback or cooperative purchase with the University of Alaska. However, their RFP document did not have any piggyback language or any type of indefinite quantity clause in it. So what we're proposing to do is secure the money, do a IFB throughout our own purchasing program, brand specific for MSA. There are 3 dealers that can sell MSA products in the state of Alaska. However, the pricing that has been guaranteed through the end of December from Arctic Fire and Safety is well below the GSA pricing. So this is a good opportunity for the North Star Fire Service area to continue interoperability with self-contained breathing apparatus within the borough. And with that, I will take any questions you may have.
Mr. Paulson. Let's see, are there any questions, Mr. Roberts?
Yeah, so I don't see a waiver Title 16 here. So he was talking about sole sourcing through an IFP process, which is mentioned as narrative. I don't see that in the ordinance itself. I was hoping legal could speak to what they're trying to do and why it's okay, and why the language in the ordinance covers it.
I think Mr. Paulson needs to answer that. When I signed off on the ordinance, I inquired as because of the brand-specific procurement and the lack of a Title 16 process that was specified, and I think he's been working with the Chief Procurement Officer separately, so.
I have been working with Chief Procurement Officer Corey Beal, who was here earlier tonight, on this, and we are going to brand-specific this due to the interoperability concept of the air packs. We're not sole sourcing the air packs because we do have multiple dealerships that can sell these packs to Alaska, but the brand specific for the interoperability to make sure that the majority and the other fire departments within the area are looking at trying to do the exact same thing so that the majority of all of the air packs within all the fire service areas in the borough are the same, including currently the military bases are also using MSA air packs along with the city of Fairbanks. So we're trying to standardize the equipment that the firefighters are all wearing so that, as you well know, at most fires that are working fires within the area has multiple departments that respond to that, utilizing the same type of equipment. So if there are firefighters that are in need of emergency assistance, whatever else, all the firefighters utilizing the same equipment, the same rapid intervention team packs, and the same training program, because we have some people that may work at one fire department, volunteer in others, so they won't have to be in different types of self-contained breathing apparatus, which is a huge safety concern in the operational side of firefighting.
Okay, so I recognize those points, and that really brings up some other questions. So it seems like every year we approve an ordinance for federal grants to buy this kind of gear, things like that. I don't know if it's, I can't remember what stuff would be fire service related and what stuff is like borough emergency ops, but what are they going to do with the currently working existing stuff they have if they're replacing it? I mean, there's probably a lot of money in the existing equipment.
There is a lot of money in the existing equipment. There may be an opportunity to do some trade-in value on their current air packs. However, the National Fire Protection Association, the NFPA, They run on a cycle. Every 5 years, they reevaluate their standards. This particular standard and NFPA 1500 for air packs is re-looked at every 5 years, and the standard for NFPA is you have to be within 2 cycles of air packs. So you basically get 15 years and then you're out of compliance according to NFPA. The current packs that are in service within the borough and at North Star Volunteer Fire Department currently will all expire at the end of 2019. So they're looking at replacing those before they basically become non-compliant to the NFPA standard. The cylinders that we utilize are carbon fiber wrapped, and those have a 15-year life on them, and after 15 years they can't be used anymore. We drill holes in them and throw them away. So that is the standard for that type of equipment.
So you're saying the vast majority of North Stars and even the boroughs are dated 2019?
That is correct.
So there won't be much resale opportunity for anyone using them for their intended purpose?
That would be correct.
Thank you.
Additional questions or discussions on this ordinance? I'm not seeing any. Thank you, Mr. Paulson.
Thank you.
Okay, that brings us next to ordinance number 2018-20-1G. This is an ordinance amending the FY 2018-19 budget by appropriating $458,000 from the general fund balance of the Transit Enterprise Projects Fund for wood stove, pellet stove retrofit, and emission control device testing. The sponsors are Mayor Castle, Assembly members Roberts, Cooper, and Lawrence. And I will first ask Mayor Castle for a staff report, and then Assembly members Roberts and Lawrence.
Thank you very much. Who's going to take the lead over there, gentlemen? I assume Nick?
I think Glenn's going to start, and then I'll jump in after I get the computer
our
up and
transportation
running.
director, Glenn Miller, is going to kick us off, and then Nick Zarnecki can jump in.
Thank you. So while Mr. Zarnecki is getting the presentation set up, I just wanted to say that this is probably certainly one of the more complex ordinances that the Air Quality Division has worked on over the last couple of months. The Air Quality Division, and specifically Mr. Zarnecki, has spent significant time working with various folks at the Environmental Protection Agency, people within the state of Alaska, DEC, various manufacturers, testing labs, trying to put together a product here that will be acceptable to all the end users. I think once we start going through this presentation, you'll appreciate not only the complexity of this ordinance and what it means to this community, but the work that Mr. Zarnecki has done on this. And also appreciate all the Assembly members that have helped us develop this ordinance, and even our legal department that has helped us out enormously with the development of this ordinance. So as soon as Nick is ready here, I'll turn it over to Nick.
And if you'll bear with me for just a moment as I get this started.
Choose the recommended.
All right, so thank you for the introduction, and I'll just kind of jump into the presentation here on this particular appropriation ordinance. And so the first thing that I wanted to do before I go into some of the specifics is that later on we'll be discussing the ordinance, and it is a little bit difficult to kind of wrap your head around the details of everything when we're just talking about the testing and the appropriations part. And so hopefully before the end of the evening we'll be able to give you the full picture with what the ordinance encompasses and what this appropriation ordinance is for. So the first thing that I thought that I would cover is why do we even need testing on these ESPs? What's the impetus behind that? And it's in the way that these ESPs are being implemented. Because the current RCD ordinance that's going to be discussed later, it's as it's written, it's not a control measure. The control measure that we're actually talking about is the curtailment program, and this ordinance is written as an exemption to the control measure. And because of all the stuff that we're in with the serious SIP and all the preparations that we have to do for that and the moderate SIP that's in place, we have to deal with the backsliding issue, which I think all of the Assembly members are up to speed on what backsliding means and the implications of it. And so basically to avoid backsliding, because this is an exemption to a current control measure, we need to have a robust quantification of the emissions from these control devices. And so that's kind of in a nutshell why testing is required. And why it's been so difficult and it's required so much staff time, consultant time, coordination with EPA along with industry experts, including various testing laboratories, is that EPA has never quantified benefits from aftermarket control devices on wood stoves. And so up here in Fairbanks, we're basically blazing new ground here in the United States, even though these devices have been implemented in places like Europe. And the testing protocol that we came up with is a result of a lot of coordinated effort between the Borough, EPA, and various industry experts. So it does represent a significant amount of staff time. And I do want to also note that there are other uses of this technology, such as requiring ESPs on all devices with a no-ash, that would be considered a control measure, and because there would be no way that there would be an emission increase if they were implemented that way, testing wouldn't be required. But again, because these are being implemented as an exemption to a current control measure, there is a possibility of emission increases, and so that's why we really have to quantify it and ensure that we're not going to be moving backwards. And so for a cost breakout of the $458,000, to just let you know what that money would be used for a testing program, what I have here is the basic cost breakout. This includes setup costs, which would be covered for all the potential testing. And then we would test 3 different device categories: a pellet device, a non-catalytic stove, and a catalytic stove. With the testing in those 3 categories, if the device actually passed the testing, then that would be sufficient data to do a wide-scale implementation on all those types of devices. And so it's actually a pretty big departure from what EPA current testing and certification requirements are on wood stoves, which require every single make and model to be tested. And so I do want to point out that they are providing some pretty significant leeway where we just have to do 6 replicate tests, and then we can apply the same testing results to a very broad category. The 6 tests are required to get sufficient data so that we can have what's determined to be a moderate emission factor with the testing program. And as you can see there, we need 6 complete tests for each of those device categories. I also have in there purchase of testo units. The testo units are handheld testing units, and those would be employed in conjunction with the laboratory testing so that we could tie the handheld units back to standard. And some of the testing that has been done up here in Fairbanks already with these units, with the testo, basically it would add some validity to the data, and it would let us determine what the best use of that data is. We've also got data collection and reporting, and then a 20% contingency fee because, as I said, we're blazing new territory, and frankly, there's going to be a lot of unknowns that come up with this process, so the 20% would give us sufficient funding to see this project through to completion. So that's where the $458,000 comes from. And also, the $458,000 is a worst-case scenario. Because pellet testing will give us the most reliable numbers. Pellets have homogeneous fuel supply, constant fuel rate, and airflow, and a lot less variability. We expect that pellet devices have the best chance of actually meeting the emission threshold that's set forth in the ordinance. And so if we run through the pellet device testing first, and the pellet device fails with the retrofit, then we don't have to proceed with it anymore, and we can cut the program at that point because we can safely say that cordwood devices, whether they're catalytically controlled or non-catalytically controlled, would not meet the emission threshold. So there are some safety outs in here where we get partway along the process and we say, well, this isn't going to make it, so we can stop the program and save the rest of the funding. Also, it doesn't include any financial contributions from the manufacturer, and as I will go through later, that'll be part of the scoring matrix. It's never a guarantee that we can get a manufacturer to contribute money for this type of testing, but it's always a possibility. And so what we intend to do for the competitive RFP process is we would proceed with a competitive RFP for the retrofit device, and it would basically go out to any manufacturer that has a device currently in production. This would include devices such as ESPs and catalysts or any other retrofit control device that can be put on a stove aftermarket and it's in a post-production phase. I do want to stress that we're not in the R&D sector right now, so we're not looking to help companies do research and development. So we really do want to focus on only post-production units that are ready for installation. The RFP would explain the ordinance, the threshold that we have, and the protocol, highlighting that any device that actually does meet this threshold, that then have a large market in Fairbanks. And we would score this competitive RFP process on a matrix that would include the final price to the consumer, existing test data, so if they have test data to augment what we are planning to get through this test protocol, the number of existing installations, so how successful is the device, and as I mentioned before, any additional financial contributions that the manufacturer would intend to make. And so through this competitive RFP process, we would select one retrofit control device to run through this testing protocol. And of course, the competitive RFP process assumes that the Assembly could appropriate funding for the testing, as this funding is not included in the current air quality budget. And concurrently, we would also release a competitive RFP to certified laboratories, because the testing protocol does specify that this testing has to be completed in a laboratory certified for wood heater testing through the EPA. And of course, we would continue to devote staff and consultant resources to developing a field protocol, because as I go through on a later presentation, those are some of the unknowns that we have still with regards to the ordinance. And so I do feel that I need to point out that it is our professional opinion that no known retrofit device that is commercially available right now will be able to achieve the emission threshold that is set in the ordinance. However, we don't know about every single device that's out there. That's just our professional opinion. That's based on some of the testing that we've seen from devices out there, through third party, through other agencies that have done testing like this, through Puget Sound, discussions with laboratories such as NESCOM in Brookhaven, and also EPA testing experts. And so it's the air quality's opinion that there could be better ways to spend local resources. For example, focusing on emission reductions instead of exemptions to the curtailment program. And the stakeholders group right now is working on a recommendation for control measures, and they're going to be working on an entire package to present to various decision makers such as the Assembly and DEC and EPA, and along with some other folks. And that recommendation is most likely going to include some use of retrofit devices. And I do also want to note that the testing results from a program such as this, that they could be useful for purposes other than the ordinance. So they could be useful for SIP purposes and other ways to utilize devices like this. I guess the big take-home point is there's a really long way to go to reach attainment. For the North Pole area, we need about 80% emission reductions, and everything is going to play an important role. There's not one single control measure out there that's going to get us all the way there. And what I'm saying here is that there are certainly ways to use these retrofit control devices that will help us reach attainment, and doing an exemption to the control measure that is the most effective near-term control measure might not be the best way to go as far as expenditures of money. However, you have to balance that against the need to provide an exemption to folks to let them continue using their devices. So it's a very difficult situation. And I'll just leave it right there for questions, and keeping in mind that we'll have a more detailed discussion later tonight too.
Thanks. And before we get into questions, I would like to ask the sponsors if they would also like to give a staff report. So Mr. Roberts, anything you want to add?
On the money part.
And yes, we're just on the money part now.
No, not on the information they presented was sufficient.
Mr. Lawrence?
No, I have nothing to add.
Right. And I'm not going to provide a staff report on this ordinance, so I would like to caution both, I guess, the administration and the Assembly that here we're going to be talking about facts, not engaging in debate about whether this is a good idea or a bad idea at this point. I appreciate there's a fine line there about staff's recommendation, but I don't want to get into, is this the best use of money or not at this point. This is the purpose of this committee, is to ask questions and have factual discussions. I have Ms. Dodge and Mr. Quist.
Thank you. So back on your slide number, I can't tell what it is, the cost breakdown. Are outdoor wood boilers included in this? Do those fall in one of those two categories?
No, outdoor wood boilers are not included in this, and the reason why is because we don't believe that retrofit control devices, the ones that are on the market today, are designed to handle the emission loads for outdoor wood boilers. And so the first cut at this ordinance is specifically to deal with lower emission devices where they have a better chance of succeeding.
Sure.
Didn't the guy that talked to us about the Minnesota test tell us that he had it on an outdoor wood boiler? Or it just was a boiler?
I don't recall the specifics of what that installation was on.
Okay, thank you. If I might ask a...
Sure.
So I'm curious about on your staff recommendation, you talked about a threshold. And I was curious what that threshold is and why it was selected. Seem to see it, but
Yeah, and that's, we've got those details in the later presentation, but the threshold is .0028 pounds per million BTU. There was an error in the APCC that was due to miscommunication on my part, and I'll cover that at the next presentation. But it's based on the equivalent of an oil-fired boiler, and it takes into account device efficiencies. And so that's the efficiency of getting the combustion heat transferred into the living space.
That's your question, Ms. Dodge.
yeah. One more, or you want somebody else?
Mr. Quist is willing to wait, so Ms.
Thank
Dodge,
you.
go ahead.
I have to figure out how to, given some of the earlier discussion, it looks like you're suggesting that the stakeholder group is going to be making recommendations in the next month or two?
The stakeholder group recommendation should come out in November. I believe it's we're going to take an extra meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so it seems like you might be suggesting here that it might be worth waiting until we get those results to make this decision, because they may inform this decision.
Correct.
Thank you.
Dodge, Mr. Quist.
Yeah, Ms. Dodge asked, I think, part of my question there, but to follow up on that, your recommendation here is ambiguous, it seems to me, or that's my reading of it. And is that, I mean, I guess just from my reading of this last page and the way you presented it, it seems ambiguous. So my guess is that, do you have a recommendation at this point? I mean, I know we're not having recommendations because we're in committee, so I'll put you on the spot.
And to be clear, I don't want administration debating either, so, I mean, we'll have plenty of time to debate,
so,
but to the extent you can...
Yeah, I mean, just to sum up, I mean, staff recommendation, I mean, is it thumbs up or thumbs down?
A thumbs wait.
Sure.
So, you know, I appreciate the intent, but this is not the place to be having a qualitative discussion about, you know, I mean, this is a fact-finding.
Okay, I guess I misunderstand I mean, I thought that the staff recommendation was an appropriate part of this discussion. I'm not going to argue about it. I just want to understand what the recommendation is, because you read this page and it doesn't make a strong statement one way or the other. It makes statements on both sides as I read it. And so I was curious, does the staff have a recommendation? I mean, the mayor's a sponsor, so, but I mean, if I'm out of order, I'll just stop, but
No,
I
I'm
didn't
trying
know
to
that
thread a fine line here. I mean, I want to avoid advocacy of one position or another in this committee discussion, so I have plenty of time for advocacy about the relative merits of this ordinance and the subsequent
So
ordinance.
I'm not advocating. I'm just asking a question, not advocating
Question
at
for
all.
a thumbs up or a thumbs down. I guess that's my
That's good
point.
then.
I don't know, Ms. Dolan can tell me if I'm out of line. Mr. Mayor, did you have a?
Yeah, I'll try to do some sewing and threading the fine line. So, you know, we've looked obviously at these devices, and the claims from manufacturers about emissions are optimistic, and they think that these devices burn as clean as fuel. And we are suspicious that that may not be the case, and from numbers that we've seen from independent third-party type research indicates they're maybe not quite as efficient and clean as what some of the manufacturers claim. So what Mr. Zarnecki was saying is, we suspect, and we don't know until we do all this research, but our professional suspect is that they will not produce emissions as clean as fuel oil does. But we don't know. So we can spend this money and find out. And that's what this ordinance is about. Here's what it's going to cost. This is an abbreviated program. We start with the cleanest device, which is the pellets. And if they fail, we know the other dirtier, so to speak, devices will fail, and there's no sense in spending that money. So looking at the budget that, well, it's not on the screen at the moment, but you could stop this at the end of the pellet test and not do the big numbers, the 130s for the stoves, if the pellets failed. So the biggest chunk of money wouldn't have to be spent at that point. So this is your decision to make. We're trying to just present the numbers as best as we can see. And as Mr. Zarnicki was pointing out, I think EPA has been generous. Normally, they would expect a much more rigorous program and make us test a number of devices, not just one. So it's not like we're trying to make this fail by any stretch of the imagination, nor is EPA, because they're always interested in objective third-party research, and they're working with us on this. But it's not cheap. So you guys get to decide. So I'm not saying thumbs up or down. I'm just trying to explain the reality of this and what we're looking at expending. And best case scenario is everything passes the test and we spend the whole budget, and then lots of these devices can use these. If you pass this ordinance, the worst case scenario would be that pellets fail and we only spend the small part of the budget, but we don't get anywhere because none of these devices then qualify. Or we kind of postpone and wait and see what the stakeholders group says too, and then go from there. So that's our opinion.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question, Mr. Close?
Yes, thank you.
Good job sewing. So I had Mr. Lawrence, Ms. Dodge, and then Mr. Tackey.
All right, regarding the staff's recommendation, our opinion that based on available test data and correspondence with various industry experts, it is your opinion that no known available retrofit control device will be able to achieve the emissions threshold. What about helping to achieve the threshold? I mean, are you saying that you don't even think an ESP would reduce PM2 emissions out of a wood stove or a pellet stove, well, a wood stove that it has it installed?
Yeah, no, an ESP would, absolutely reduce the emissions. The thing with this ordinance is that because it is an exemption to a control measure, we have to ensure that the emission reductions are equivalent to what the control measure would achieve. And so that's what the emission threshold is based on. They will certainly reduce the emissions, but the question is, will they reduce them sufficiently to meet that threshold?
And you're saying the control measure is burning fuel oil rather than wood?
Correct.
And that's coming from EPA?
That is coming from a combination of EPA and DEC and lots of interagency consultation as to how could this ordinance be crafted to avoid backsliding. So yeah, that's where it's coming from.
Well, a couple more. To make sure I understand what standard we're having to achieve here, if every wood stove in this borough, or at least in the air quality control zone, was shut down, and those homes and businesses utilized fuel oil instead, then it's presumed that the PM 2.5 emission standards would be met, right?
Actually, DEC did do a modeling run where they replaced all of the wood heating needs with number 2 fuel oil. So they basically modeled the scenario that you just explained, and the results of that model showed that attainment is possible. So under that situation, if we eliminated all of the wood burning, replaced all of those heating requirements with number 2 fuel oil, we can show attainment in the area. That's what the model suggests, and DEC has completed that work within the last couple of months, and so it's a fairly recent study. So that has been done. What I want to show you right now, and this is something that we can get into later, but this shows the basic magnitude of emission reductions that are available from certain control measures. And there's certainly a lot of nuances and assumptions that are associated with this slide that I'll get into a little bit later. But let me actually do this slideshow. What this shows is this will give you an idea of the emission reductions for the curtailment program versus emission reductions from retrofit control devices. If you look on the left hand of that chart, you see that the curtailment program with a 20% compliance rate will net us approximately 0.45 tons per day in emission reductions. If we can increase that compliance rate up to 50%, then the emission reductions increase up to 1.14 tons per day. As you can see from this chart, ignoring the large green bar in the center that I'll explain in the next presentation, that's the biggest emission reduction that we have, is the curtailment program. Now, over on the far right-hand side, you have retrofit control devices, and this is where you'll see that they're still going to be a part of the solution. Is they're one of the other largest emission reductions at 0.62 tons per day. Now, what you need to know is that the assumptions that went into that calculation were that we installed a retrofit control device on every single solid fuel burning appliance within the non-attainment area. And actually not every single one. We installed it on all EPA certified stoves, EPA certified pellet stoves, and those devices. We excluded outdoor hydronic heaters, coal heaters, and fireplaces because it's not practical to install it on those devices. And so these numbers, what they represent, are kind of a theoretical maximum of the emission reductions that we can achieve from these categories. And so this gives you an idea of what the curtailment program can net us versus what a wide-scale implementation of retrofit control devices can net us. And this is where if you provide an exemption to the curtailment program and the exemption does not have all the necessary sidebars like that threshold and long-term performance, that biggest bar of 1.14 tons per day, that theoretical maximum is going to be reduced. And so I know I kind of threw a whole bunch of information at you, but did that kind of answer your question about the oil?
Yeah, just one final question. This model, can this community be in compliance with emission standards if we have some wood burning in this community?
The model was run assuming 5% no ash, and so that's approximately 500 wood stoves in operation, and that showed compliance. We're working on providing answers to the stakeholders group regarding, the number of appliances that can be operated and still reach attainment. So we're actively working on that number.
And we don't have it yet.
No, we don't have it yet.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. So on my list, I have Ms. Dodge, Mr. Tackey, and Mr. Roberts. Ms. Dodge.
Well, that helped answer one of my questions. So I guess one of my questions is this device, clearly it's a very broad net that you're proposing to cast when you define devices. Purpose.
The retrofit control devices? That is correct. We did not want to limit it to a single manufacturer.
Or type, it sounded like, as you explained things.
Correct.
And if you have third-party data, is that not something that the EPA has accepted? So you were referring to third-party data for some of the devices that you might? solicit or that might respond?
Yeah, well, there are lots of types of data out there, and it really depends on the quality of data that we have, because all data is not created equal. And so, for example, there was some testing that were done on ESP devices last winter by citizens here in the borough, and they did a fantastic job going out on their own and doing their best to gather data. Unfortunately, the quality of the testing device isn't sufficient to be able to quantify emissions. It's sufficient enough to tell us that yes, the device is functioning and it's removing particulate, but just due to the limitations, not all data is of the quality that we
Right,
need.
but this is specifically third-party data that you were referring.
Yeah, in third-party data, and that refers to testing also. There are a lot of test methods out there. There's a lot of different testing types, and we spent a lot of time with EPA going back and forth on the testing types that would provide the quality of data that's required, and none of the third-party data meets those quality standards. EPA is actually willing to accept any third-party data that meets those standards. It's just that we haven't found any yet, and we have looked under all the rocks that we can.
Thank you.
All right, before I go to Mr. Tackey, Mr. Roberts, just a reminder, we're on the appropriating ordinance here, so I'm allowing some latitude because it's crossing boundaries, but Mr. Tackey and then Mr. Roberts.
Thanks. What is your expected timeline for getting results if this was approved next Thursday?
The timeline would be it would take us a couple months to run through the RFP process to get things appropriated, and then another month to secure lab time. Take us another month to actually get some of the laboratory testing done and then get the reports issued. So probably 6 months from when you guys say go till when we could see the first result.
So then we're not going to have results then in time for the stakeholders group, correct?
No, the results wouldn't be for the stakeholders group. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mr. Tackey, Mr. Roberts.
So your 1.14 bar and your 0.62 bar. So you said that 0.62 actually causes a decrease in the 1.14 if applied simultaneously if we can't get to the level of oil, because 1.14 is based on converting everything to oil, or 50% no burn, which means they're burning oil instead of wood. So have you constructed the curves to see where they meet that we get the optimum amount of pollution decrease by putting in a certain number of ESPs, realizing that balancing effect? There should be a way to calculate a number, and the number I'm looking for is, instead of having to go to 0.00028, are we able to go to a different number and still achieve the results we want, instead of just, because right now we're just taking that oil number. How about we actually calculate it out based on your model to see where the number needs to be to get us where we want to go? Have we done that kind of math? And I'm only asking because we have this graph in front of us. And so I thought it was
Well, and
relevant.
so my question for Mr. Zarnecki, though, is will that question be better answered in the context of the next presentation? Because we've got one graph in front of us now and a whole presentation that graph is part of. And
Yeah, it's difficult to unpack and pull all these issues apart, and that question would certainly be better addressed in the next presentation.
is that all right, Mr. Roberts, if we just take it? Because I think the context of that full presentation, which is much thicker than this one, will help provide some.
That's fine. So I have
Okay.
a point I wanted to make, that one of the benefits of the testing, they mentioned, we might be able to get some data to be able to use it for things like no ashes, or to affect other parts of the code even if we don't accomplish the goal we're trying to achieve right now, which I'll actually talk more about in the next ordinance. But another thing it will do, by getting some actual testing in, the EPA will get that testing, and this part of this may spur them to do the kind of in-depth, robust testing, so that one day we may get them to let us get an exception to their backsliding and apply more of these ESPs instead of us, because we're guessing right now that they're not going to let us go a little bit farther. That's why we're picking such an incredibly small number that's the same as oil, because we're kind of guessing. So a benefit of this will be getting some information that may get the EPA looking deeper into it. That's a very long-term goal, of course.
Right. Additional questions or discussion on the appropriating ordinance? I don't see any. I look forward to passing this hot potato on to Mr. Lawrence and the committee of the whole. All right, so don't go far. That takes us to the end of advanced ordinances and resolutions and other committee business discussion items, monthly budget reports and general fund, updated fund balance reports. Any comments, questions, or discussion on those items? Seeing none, mayor and assembly comments limited to finance committee topics. Mayor Castle, any finance?
Nothing, thank you.
Does any committee member have a topic related to finance issues? Mr. Quist?
Thank you. Just more of a finance committee comment and question than a finance comment or question. So I just want to be clear earlier, I wasn't trying to advocate for any position. I was actually just trying to understand. And I would appreciate at some point some clarity either from the chair, from legal, or the administration as to what is and what isn't allowed. I mean, it's been my understanding and my experience that when staff gives a report on an ordinance in committee, that a recommendation is part of that, and that doesn't, in my mind, enter into debate. I mean, I completely understand that as committee members we don't want to debate, but so I mean, if that's not the case, and like no recommendation can be made even in a staff report by a sponsor, then I would suggest that we don't use phrases like staff recommendation in reports. But I mean, the mere, in my estimation, the mere act of sponsoring an ordinance and giving a staff report in a way has some degree of recommendation. And anyways, I mean, I'm not trying to make a big deal out of this, but it seems like it caused a little kerfuffle, and it would be good to know like what it is that we can hear in a staff report and what we can't. And the one thing that I think is crystal clear is that committee members outside of staff reports definitely shouldn't be engaging in debate. And at some point, I would be curious where that line is.
I'll see if there are other comments, and then I'll respond to yours, Mr. Quist. Are there other finance committee related comments? Any member? Seeing none, Mr. Quist, I'm happy to work with the clerks and Ms. Dolan to have a better definition. I certainly think that staff recommendations in the regular assembly meeting about one way or the other, like we like this or we hate this, are appropriate. And I think it was the second bullet on the staff recommendation that caught my eye, where there was a decision about there could be better ways to spend the money. And the way you framed your question, thumbs up or thumbs down on this, that caused me to have that response. I think that the mayor answered the question appropriately and in the way that I think was informative about what maybe the gist of your question was, which is, are you trying to tell us to vote one way or the other on this, or what is your recommendation? I thought that the mayor did a good job of saying these are the options. In my mind, subject to further discussion with the clerk's office and Ms. Dolan, that this committee setting, the appropriate discussion is to find out about the facts and not to get into qualitative, is it good or is it bad, is it the right decision or the wrong decision? But I may be wrong. So,
I mean, if I may, okay, so and that makes perfect sense, and it was exactly that same bullet point that led me to ask that question, because it felt like there was a recommendation in here, and I just wasn't clear what it was. Right.
So my preference would be that the staff make that qualitative recommendation at the assembly meeting rather than in a committee meeting, unless the clerks and Ms. Dolan say that my interpretation is incorrect. So
I don't think there's a problem with making a recommendation, but what you're not supposed to do is engage in debate. So all your questions are supposed to be to clarify and inform. So to the extent you start questioning the recommendation, it could lead to debate. So I think it's a fine line. And it's ultimately the chair's ruling as to whether or not you're crossing the line.
And I try to take a conservative view towards debate because I would rather have this not get into the debate at the committee level because we've got a lot of time for that. My view is that the committee is a great place to become informed so that we can be informed going into the debate next week. But.
Thank you.
All right, anything else finance related? See none, adjourn.